analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. The French Justice Minister, Christiane Taubira, has again been subjected to racist slurs. It was the third time in a month. The latest attack happened last week and came from a far-right magazine which compared her, and she is the most prominent black politician in France, to a monkey. Taubira's position on gay marriage has endeared her to the left, but has turned her into a target for the far right. And racism seems to be growing in other parts of Europe, and not even high-profile ministers seem to be spared. In April, in Italy, Cécile Kashetu became the country's first black minister after being appointed Minister for Integration in the current Italian government. And yet she was called orangutan by a member of the far right in the Italian Senate. To discuss these issues, we have in the studio Bill Bowring, Director of Human Rights and at Birkbeck College, University of London, Massoud Shadjareh from the Islamic Human Rights Commission. On the phone from Bristol is Professor Gino Raymond, Professor of Modern French Studies at the University of Bristol, and on Skype from Leicester is Professor Carlo Ruzza, Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Leicester. Welcome to you all. But before we start, let's just watch this report from Emmanuel Nunes.
This is how it all started, a Photoshop picture that compares Christiane Taubira to a monkey. Its author, Anne-Sophie Leclerc, a member of the National Front. And this is the latest attack. Taubira is again compared to a monkey. This time, the racist attack came from Minute, a far-right magazine. Racism seems to be growing in France, and the Minister of Justice is apparently the easiest target for those who have no other arguments. The French government wants the people to unite against racism.
I think she is a strong woman. There's no doubt about that. But there comes a point when in our country we need to unite and say stop. To act that way and to publish such disgraceful newspapers is to disfigure France.
You know that Christiane Taubira, the Justice Minister who was violently attacked as a person because she's black, by extreme right and the press at the far right. And this should give rise to outrage and mobilize the society. We should never accept racism.
The attacks on Taubira have sparked all tensions in the French society, and that poses questions. Is racism growing in France? And which role has been played by the far right? Also last week, French and Dutch far-right leaders had a meeting hoping to establish a coalition ahead of the European elections. And in Italy, another black minister was also verbally attacked by the far-right party. So are we looking at a wave of far-right and racism in just some countries? Or is this an European problem?
Well, let me start with you, Professor Gino Raymond. You're Professor of Modern French Studies. Why is racism growing so much in France at the moment?
Apart from the obvious factors such as the terrible situation, economic situation in France and all the pressures that flow from that, the Taubira case is actually a very interesting one, and the fact that you have, as you pointed out, there have been several insults hurled at her, but one of the insults was from a magazine called Minute. And it's very interesting that one of the closest confidants of the former French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, was a man called Patrick Buisson, who had been the editor of Minute. So there is a broader context to this, in that under the previous presidency in France, you had figures with far-right credentials who had actually become part of the presidential inner circle and had helped actually to define presidential discourse in a number of famous speeches. You had a hardening of the language, a hardening of the tone taken by Sarkozy, and this had a kind of ripple effect politically. It's not surprising that subsequently people felt emboldened to use harsher language, effectively more discriminatory, more racist language, because in a sense the example was coming from the top. By recruiting Buisson into his inner circle from Minute, Sarkozy had in a sense legitimized some of those ideas.
Well, is there anything that can be done under French law or French regulations to take these magazines to court for their incredible language?
Well, as you know, Ayrault, the Prime Minister, and Valls also have discussed the possibility of this. And in fact, France, in contrast to, for example, to countries like Britain, For example, negationism in France is illegal, and it has prosecuted people with regard to that in the past. And there is talk now of using legislation to suppress this. What's interesting is that Taubira herself wasn't particularly keen on this to start with, because she didn't want to actually give these people, these groups and these publications the oxygen of publicity. And what she really wanted was a vigorous response from French civil society. But I think she's been quite disappointed in that respect.
Well, let me come on to Carlo Ruzza to tell us what's actually happening in Italy. I mean, we mentioned that the Minister of Integration was called an orangutan. I mean, would you say it's as bad in Italy as in France, or was this an aberration, this one comment?
No, I think it's just as bad, and it's not new. In fact, I think the Italian case is very similar to the French case, except that it's been lasting for a longer period and has a number of targets, which is fairly wide and includes Islamic believers and various acts of insults to Islam, but also obviously in the case of the Minister Kyenge, also involved tossing bananas on stage, which is fairly similar to what is happening in France. So the orangutan incident is just the last, and then go back to I think April, but then in the following few months it became even bigger as an incident because there was a fairly violent campaign by the Northern League explaining that they thought comparing people to animals is actually perfectly acceptable. Just like you say somebody's courageous, like a lion, then you can say that somebody's like a monkey. And in justifying their actions, they were actually increasing the level of insults, as you might imagine. And then, the next day, another supporter of the Northern League published a Photoshop image of Minister Kyenge, the MP, sitting at her desk in the parliament with her face changing to the orangutan. And so on and so forth. So it is as bad. And
what is the reaction from the other political parties? I mean, like the left and the centre in Italy. I mean, are they denouncing these people, or do they just sort of get away with it because nobody really criticises them publicly?
Well, the reaction is a reaction of, is a strong reaction. Is a reaction of rage. Is a reaction of threats of legal proceedings, but this is precisely what the extreme right wants. Reactions are exactly what is wanted. We have a Northern League, which is an extreme right, separatist Northern Italian party, which has been declining the electorate and it's lost relevance in the media. And what they want is to be controversial. So negative reactions is precisely what they want. And is what they get. And obviously what they do typically is to say something completely outrageous and then to apologize and then to have people say resign. But, this is all calculated. They'll come back. Minister... Sorry, Corey, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to bring in the other two guests. I mean, Bill Bowring, Britain has no reason to be terribly complacent, but this kind of language that French and the Italians have been talking about, that it's not really possible in Britain, is it, that somebody would call a British minister an orangutan or a monkey? Haven't we progressed a little bit beyond that kind of name calling?
I think we have been fortunate in Britain in having really rather strong race relations and anti-discrimination laws, actually, I think ahead of many other parts of Europe. But I think the phenomena which we now see in France and Italy and other countries are not confined to those countries by any means. And of course, in France and Netherlands, you have rather charismatic and popular leaders of the right. So Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders, we saw in the film clip just now. I think that is a very worrying phenomenon and includes, and of course the background to this is governments which portray migrants, Roma, people of other religions in negative terms. And that then becomes the soil in which these kind of extreme phenomena can grow.
Well, Massoud, I mean, your Islamic Human Rights Commission has recently produced a pamphlet on hate speech in France. You brought it into the studio. I mean, can anything be done about this hate speech, or is it just a phenomenon that we have to accept?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's important to recognize France in particular is unusual in the rest of the Western world that doesn't recognize minorities. Actually, France says that there's no minorities, we are all French. So, you know, any work you want to do in France which identify the right of minorities, since they don't recognize even existence of minorities, it creates a huge obstacle. But I think what is really important to recognize is for a very long time we've been saying that Islamophobia is a form of legitimization of racism. And once you actually legitimize it through Islamophobia, then it will go to other arenas. And we were talking about Le Pen and Wilders. They been sort of riding the waves of Islamophobia, and then now we are seeing that it's being extended to others, not just in France and in Britain. I mean, Wilders was invited here to the Parliament to show his film and supported by the mainstream political parties, including UKIP. Now, we are seeing this, basically the chicken is coming home to roost, and for a very long time we've been saying that the rise of fascism and Islamophobia is something that needs to be under check. And unfortunately, it's never too late to stop it. But the reality is that we need to have legislations. We need to have a change of culture. What is happening is not just a bunch of extreme right. I wish it was the bunch of loony rights who are just involved in this. We've got mainstream politicians are also involved in this creation of otherness and the culture of hate. And the politics of hate. We used to have race cards being played. Now we've seen Islamophobic cards are being played at the time of elections. And these are the sort of things that unfortunately is not just in France and Italy and the rest of Europe, is actually flourishing in Britain.
Well, let's just go back to France for a moment. I mean, Professor Raymond, Marine Le Pen, who we've mentioned a number of times already, she's getting something like 42% rating in the public opinion polls. I mean, she'll do terribly well in the European Parliament elections next year, won't she? She's
a very clever politician. And what's interesting, I listened to my Italian colleague talking about the Northern League. The thing is that with regard to the statements made about Taubira and the statements, the very negative statements and demonstrations against gay marriage and so on, Marine Le Pen has very cleverly distanced herself from that, because to come back to the point that's already been made a moment ago, the process now is to gain legitimacy. And she is very astute, very clever, distancing herself from her father's legacy, from his overtly anti-Semitic legacy, from his overtly xenophobic legacy. She is now looking to give herself basically the same standing as a centre-right or a traditional right party. And unfortunately, she's being helped in that unwittingly, unintentionally, by the disorganization and the incoherence of the traditional right-wing, parliamentary right-wing, centre-right parties in France. So, as I say, she is now in the process of making her party mainstream, and she's encountering considerable success on that front.
Well, what about in Italy, Carlo Ruzza? I mean, there is a coalition government, but it's fairly shaky. I mean, what are the Northern League and the more right-wing parties doing equally well in the polls as Marine Le Pen in France?
No, I mean, that's precisely the issue. The Northern League has been traditionally changing its discourse and alternating between periods of radicalization and periods of institutionalization. And at the moment, they are in a period of radicalization precisely because they're weak, because the coalition is weak, and they are particularly weak. They've been caught in a number of corruption scandals. involving their leaders, and so they have declined substantially. And this is the time when they become more extreme. Basically, I think if you compare it to the French case and also to the British case, there are two things that should be mentioned, I think. One is that in proportional systems, like the Italian system, obviously you have a competition among parties that includes competition to the extremes. And so you have parties that carve a little niche on the extreme left or on the extreme right, which you typically don't have in Britain. And then in terms of political legitimacy, again, you know, if you have a law as the current law that doesn't really encourage real collaboration among parties, except for the first period of electoral campaign, as you have in Italy, then this is something that is typically natural and will happen. At some point, parties bet on the next election, not the current election, so they want to be as covered by the media as possible, and therefore as outlandish and as extreme as they can. And
what about Silvio Berlusconi? I mean, he can be blamed for many things that have gone wrong in Italy, but did he also, when he was sort of really in power and prime minister, was he also fostering this kind of Islamophobic, racist talk, even if he was doing it more subtly than coming out directly?
Well, not very subtly. I mean, he for instance, stated that he was lucky that he wasn't born gay, or he said that he admired Obama for his beautiful tan, and so on, you know. So yes, he has produced a number of really unacceptable statements, but not as unacceptable as the Northern League. I mean, Berlusconi, again, is in a completely different kind of game politically. He wants to essentially improve his own business fortune, and he wants to be noted, but he doesn't want to be ostracized by other politicians. He wants to be acceptable to the popular parties of Europe, and including to the European Parliament. So he says things that you know, he thinks his electorate find funny, but not outright offensive, although actually they are offensive. So it's a question of degrees, I would say.
Well, let's come back to you again, Professor Raymond. I mean, France, as Massoud pointed out, has this specific feature of doesn't really sort of accept multiculturalism. Everybody has to be assimilated and become sort of true French. I mean, is it partly to do with this confusion over identity in France, not just an economic question?
Well, you have fundamental philosophical issues here, and you have a Republican ideology which assumes essentially that once you enter the public sphere as a citizen, then you put aside your differences and you basically, the values you espouse are the values of the Republic that bind everybody together. And it's that philosophical distinction in French Republican ideology between the private sphere and the public sphere that creates so much difficulty. Because as we all know, in real life, it's not that simple. And there's also a historical element to this, which is that there is that strong streak of anti-clericalism in modern French history. In other words, militant secularism. And there was an understandable justification for this, because part of the creation of modern France was the battle against the Catholic Church, the battle against the influence of the Catholic Church and the association of the Catholic Church with the inequality of the Ancien Regime and all the injustices that flowed from that. Now, what has happened, and certain sociologists have picked up on this and argued this point, that with the decline of the Catholic Church in France, with the virtual disappearance of it in terms of its political importance or its influence in French society, you have a kind of militant secularism in France that's looking for another sphere in which to operate. And to a certain extent, laïcité or secularism and the tradition of militant secularism seems to have found a new target in Islam.
Well, Bill Bowring, I mean, on the issue of law, I mean, can anything be done in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights to try and correct these injustices?
Well, for example, I think Britain could set a good example by ratifying Protocol number 12, which would make any form of discrimination a violation of human rights. And for our own reasons, we've so far been refusing to do that. And I would say that the position of the British government is so far really rather equivocal. Part of the difference between Britain and some of the continental countries is that so far the Conservative Party has been successful in incorporating within itself people who might in other countries be forming separate right-wing parties. And one can see, as I mentioned, that when it comes to migrants, to Roma and other people in this country, that actually the ground is being laid for just this kind of phenomenon. I would say we can't be complacent.
Have other European countries recognised this, incorporated this Article 12 that you mentioned?
Yes, they have.
So Britain is rather the exception then?
Yes, I think it makes us look really quite bad. And of course, when there is talk, as there is at present, of getting out of the European Convention on Human Rights altogether because it's somehow un-British, and when we are the only country defying the European Court of Human Rights at the present time, all of this, of course, I think makes it possible for racist phenomena to grow very rapidly indeed.
And Professor Raymond, do you expect that the suburbs around Paris could sort of explode again as they did a few years ago if this intolerance from politicians increases?
Well, the potential is always there, and you're getting, and it's become so banal, it's not reported anymore. One of the things which occurs almost every weekend in one or other provincial town in Paris is the burning of cars. There is social disorder, small scale, and it's become rather banal. And you're having also quite worrying developments now. For example, in Marseille, not that long ago, you had local residents who actually attacked a camp of Roma to drive them out. So you have a social fabric which is unraveling, and there is the possibility of a spark igniting some kind of wider social unrest. If you recall, it was a police stop and search of young people which sparked the last one. And again, it can happen very rapidly, and it could take hold in a significant fashion. That's certainly possible.
Massoud, how dangerous is this fact that some of these right-wing parties at the European level are beginning to get together for the next European Parliament?
It is dangerous, but really I think I have to say that it's more dangerous the fact that, for example, our Conservative Party and indeed even Labour are actually going down the same route of xenophobic tendencies. The discussion over Roma just a few days ago was a great example of that. And there was really no one shed an eyelid for, really xenophobic statement from both Labour Party and Conservative Party. And I'm actually very concerned that we are promoting a concept of nationalism, and we are saying that there is erosion of our identity. And there is to some extent because we are becoming European rather than just being British, etc. And people are trying to reintroduce and strengthen that identity, and they're using others as a concept. Same thing that what happened at the time of Nazis, or indeed at the time of Bosnia.
We have to end. I'm sorry to cut you off. And stay with us because we'll be shifting gear a little bit in the second half and talking about the Home Secretary Theresa May's new doctrine that citizenship is no longer a right, but a privilege. Stay with us.
Carlo.